All right, we're going to begin looking at chapter 19 over the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system does return fluids leaked from the cardiovascular system at capillaries back to the blood, and that will travel back to the heart. So back towards the heart. It's a one-way system or a one-way path. In order to look at the lymphatic system, we have to first examine what makes it up. There's three main parts. There's a network of lymphatic vessels, which we call lymphatics, lymph, which is the fluid that you find in the lymphatic vessels, and lymph nodes, which cleanse the lymph so they act as filters. But we also can't forget lymphoid organs and tissues. These are going to be able to provide a structural basis for the immune system. They house white blood cells that are generally phagocytic, and they're also going to be able to house white blood cells like lymphocytes, which can turn into T and B cells. Structures that we consider lymphoid organs and tissues include the spleen, the thymus, tonsils, lymph nodes, and other lymphoid tissues such as the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So again, main function of the lymphatic system is returning interstitial fluid and leaked plasma proteins back to the blood. And this return is going to be by collecting this fluid at the cardiovascular capillary beds and pumping this fluid towards the heart. So that's going to be a one-way path. The lymphatic vessels, which we're calling lymphatics, they're the elaborate network of drainage vessels. And we're going to use specifically lymphatic capillaries, which weave themselves through cardiovascular capillaries to not only suck up this fluid that once inside the lymphatic vessels is called lymph, but we're going to use the lymphatic vessels to connect to collecting vessels, which include things like lymphatic trunks and eventually ducts. We're able to see that about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day is circulated in the lymphatic system. And once that interstitial fluid enters the lymphatics, that's when we're going to call that fluid lymph, once it enters the lymphatics. Lymphatic vessels do offer that one-way system. This one-way system is towards the heart, so that ensures that lymph flows only towards the heart, and it'll merge back into the cardiovascular system in between 2 blood vessels. And we're going to look at that junction where these ducts of the lymphatic system drain the lymph back into the cardiovascular system. They're near the heart. Lymph vessels or lymphatics include those lymphatic capillaries. So we want to talk about them in more detail because they kind of do the first major work of a lymphatic system. They are blind-ended vessels. They weave between the cardiovascular capillaries, and this means that they weave between tissue cells as well, because all around the cardiovascular capillaries, we have these blood capillaries mixing in or near tissues in order to provide them nutrients and oxygen. But we also know that at cardiovascular capillaries, that fluid exits at the arterial end of the capillary bed, and then some of it enters back in at the venous end. But not all of that fluid that ends up in the interstitial space at cardiovascular capillaries gets back to, or into, I should say, the venous end of that cardiovascular capillary. So luckily we have these lymphatic capillaries that can suck up the extra interstitial fluid. Once they do, that fluid becomes lymph, and we'll pump that back towards the heart. In order to return this fluid back to the cardiovascular system, put it back in blood vessels, and it really does help us also maintain blood pressure and volume. We do know, however, that lymphatic capillaries are absent from bones, teeth, the bone marrow, and we thought they were absent from the central nervous system. We thought there are no lymphatic capillaries whatsoever in the brain or the spinal cord. They're just not in that central nervous system. But rather recent research actually found that that's not the case. That in a couple of limited locations, for example, around the meningeal layers that cover the brain and spinal cord, you can actually find lymphatic capillaries. And they're there, we think, to help drain interstitial fluid and cerebrospinal fluid. So again, lymphatic capillaries are found next to cardiovascular capillaries or blood capillaries. They're much more permeable than our blood capillaries. Now, I know we have different types of blood capillaries. There was continuous, fenestrated, sinusoidal. So if you had to compare lymphatic capillaries to one of those, they're a little bit closer to sinusoidal, but I'd put them in between sinusoidal and fenestrated. But since they're all that permeable, we can say on the whole that lymphatic capillaries are more permeable than blood capillaries because they can take in larger molecules. They can take in proteins. They can take in plenty of particles that blood capillaries cannot. So examples again, proteins, cell debris, pathogens, cancer cells. A lot of this belies the function of our lymphatics, which is to return stuff, not just watery fluid, back to the cardiovascular system. So if really important plasma proteins were, for example, to leak out of a damaged blood capillary, we want to be able to get that back into the system, back into our blood. And we can do that thankfully to the lymphatic capillaries because of their increased permeability. So lymphatic capillaries do act as a route for pathogens or cancer cells to travel throughout the body, but hopefully they get filtered through a lymph node. They get identified, they get attacked by, for example, maybe a T or B cell, or even an NK cell, which is a natural killer cell. Figure 19.1a is a great example of just how interconnected the lymphatic capillaries are with blood capillaries. We've seen the top image before where we have a one-way path from blood capillaries to the heart via our lymphatics, which are here in green. A lot of the lymphatics are going to be in green. It's really to set it apart from the red and blue cardiovascular system. And we can see up close how much the lymphatic capillaries weave through the blood capillary. So just a good idea to look at that image to orient yourself to what we're talking about. So let's talk about the structure of lymphatic capillaries more and how it helps with their function. We know they have increased permeability, and that's due to two specialized structures. The fact that their endothelial cells overlap, kind of like the shingles on a roof, and the way that they overlap creates these one-way mini-valves. And these mini-valves are held in place. They're anchored by collagen filaments to part of the extracellular matrix. And what happens is if the extracellular fluid volume increases, it pushes on these overlapping mini-valves and they open to allow fluid to rush into or inside of the lymphatic capillaries. And these are one-way mini-valves. So once the fluid is in, it's not coming back out. We wouldn't see that decreased extracellular fluid volume would open these mini-valves. It's only that increased volume that pushes them open. Decreased extracellular fluid volume would actually cause them to close, or we wouldn't see any fluid move into the lymphatic capillaries in that case. There are also specialized lymphatic capillaries. These specialized lymphatic capillaries are called lacteals. So lacteals are specialized lymph capillaries, and they're present in locations such as the small intestinal mucosa. Their purpose is to absorb fat, and specifically digested fat. This digested fat is going to be called chyle when it's in a lacteal. And we're going to deliver this fatty lymph called chyle to the blood. So here's a good figure for the specialized lymphatic capillaries. We can see the anchoring collagen filaments. We can see overlapping endothelial cells, kind of like roof shingles. Imagine on the outside of this lymphatic capillary, we have a lot of fluid building up, and it would push on this mini valve. So we'd push this endothelial cell in, and that fluid would flow inside. But when that fluid puts pressure on the inside of the lymphatic capillary, the inside of that mini valve, it would push it closed. So they are one-way valves, much like the valves that we find in the heart, in that they are both one way. Their structure, though, is much more similar to either a semilunar valve or a venous valve. In our larger lymphatic vessels, we're going to see that the lymph, the fluid that we finally got into our lymph capillaries, is going to not only drain into these larger lymphatic vessels, but move towards the heart. We would call these larger lymphatic vessels collecting vessels or collecting lymphatic vessels. They consist of not only collecting vessels, but collecting trunks or lymphatic trunks, depending on the terminology in what you're looking up, and lymphatic ducts. there are two lymphatic ducts that we're going to look at. These larger lymphatic vessels have thin walls like veins, but they have more internal valves than we saw in veins. They even form junctions, or what we're calling anastomose, more frequently than veins. We know veins anastomose more frequently than arteries. Well, lymphatic vessels actually anastomose more frequently than veins. And a lot of these collecting vessels travel with veins, travel with arteries, depending on the location of the lymphatic vessel. So let's look at those lymphatic trunks. So first, lymph enters the lymphatic capillaries. Then a lymph flows into the lymphatic collecting vessels. Next, it'll flow into the lymphatic trunks. Now, lymphatic trunks are formed by the union of multiple collecting vessels. They drain certain areas of the body. For example, we have some in the lumbar region. We have some in the thoracic cavity, the bronchomediastinal. Some around the cervical region or near the neck, the subclavian. Some near the jugular arteries or internal jugulars. And we also have some around the intestines. So you can see that we have a couple of different lymphatic trunks. And most of them are paired. The only one that's going to be single will be the intestinal trunk. Once we have fluid leave the trunks, it'll be drained or delivered to the two large lymphatic ducts. Now there's a right lymphatic duct and a thoracic duct. And you do need to know what parts of the body the ducts drain. But you really only have to learn one of them because the other one drains the rest of the body. So you need to know that the right lymphatic duct drains the right upper arm, right side of the head, and the right side of the thorax. So basically the right side of the upper body, essentially, and then include your upper limb on that right side. Whereas the thoracic duct just drains everything else. So we'll look at where those two are located. In about half of the individuals that you would look at, we would see that the thoracic duct is essentially only an enlarged sac that really starts out as a part of the cisterna chyli. The cisterna chyli is an area that kind of collects or is able to consolidate, probably a better word, that chyle from lacteals. But each duct, whether it's thoracic duct or the right lymphatic duct, is going to be able to empty lymph into venous circulation at a junction between internal jugulars and subclavian veins. But it's going to be on its own side of the body. So you probably already know that you should suspect the right lymphatic duct's on the right side of the body. You'd be correct, meaning the thoracic duct is going to empty on the left side of the body. The right lymphatic duct actually happens to be really close to where it drains, whereas the thoracic duct is going to be a little more medial to the body and the trunk. So let's point out our major lymphatic ducts, and you'll see a couple of trunks here as well, so I'll try to point those out. But let's come over here and look at the right lymphatic duct first. So we know that that drains lymph from the right upper limb, right side of the head, and the right thorax. We see it right in this general area. So right where the junction of the internal jugular, this would be the right jugular trunk, or near the right jugular trunk over here, and the right subclavian vein, which is going to be near the right subclavian trunk over here. But the junction of those two veins is near the junction of those two lymphatic trunks, and where they meet, that is going to be the right lymphatic duct. Our thoracic duct is going to drain back into a venous structure in a similar location. Now, we know it drains lymph from the rest of the body that's not drained by the right lymphatic duct. We know it's emptying blood back into emptying its lymph into the blood at this junction of two venous structures, which is going to be another internal jugular vein, another subclavian vein near another subclavian trunk, and another jugular trunk, just left instead of right. But I want to point out, because this image is a little misleading, this is figure 19.2 in your lecture textbook, the thoracic duct is not located there. The right lymphatic duct is. The thoracic duct is actually located right here. It's not even really exciting looking. It's just located where we have two trunks kind of come together. So we have an offshoot over here. You can see a couple of different lymph nodes, and it's above the cisterna chyli. So kind of a small outpocketing of the cisterna chyli. But the thoracic duct is going to be located in your trunk, kind of in the middle, whereas the right lymphatic duct is located actually up here where it drains back into venous structure. So just keep that in mind. So entrance of right lymphatic duct into vein. Over here would be entrance of thoracic duct into vein. Thoracic duct is located down here. The right lymphatic duct is actually located right near where it enters back into a vein. Both ducts enter into venous structures at the junction between internal jugulars and subclavian veins, and that entrance tends to be near jugular and subclavian trunks where those two merge. Let's talk about a couple of clinical imbalances. One homeostatic imbalance is lymphangitis, which is a condition in which lymphatic vessels appear to be inflamed. They appear painful. They may cause red lines under the skin. And this inflammation is generally of larger lymphatic vessels that contain a vasovasorum, which you should have heard about or remember from when we talked about large arteries and veins. It means vessels of the vessels. And if they become congested with blood, this inflammation can occur. Vessels of the vessels are going to be blood vessels that serve tissues that otherwise could get nutrients from either blood running through them or nearby circulation, but they're so far away from this nearby circulation that they need their own blood vessels. So larger lymphatics, like blood vessels, receive their nutrients from branching vasovasorum of their own tunics. Next, let's look at lymph transport. So the lymph system is kind of like the pulmonary circuit. Very low pressure. It's kind of like veins also in that way. They're not going to have a really thick muscle layer. We don't have the same tunic, so I won't say they don't have a thick tunica media, but they don't have a thick layer of muscle. We see, because they're like veins, that lymph, the fluid that runs through the lymphatics, is going to be propelled by the same mechanisms as the mechanisms that make sure that blood gets through the venous system and back to the heart. So these include the milking action of skeletal muscle, pressure changes in the thorax during breathing, valves that prevent backflow, pulsation of nearby arteries, and then contractions of smooth muscles in the walls of lymphatics. All of these are able to help propel lymph back towards the heart, where we can drain this lymph at the junction of the two venous structures of the internal jugulars and subclavian veins. Physical activity is known to increase flow of lymph back towards the heart, and that's why sometimes it's recommended that a injured area is immobilized for a short period of time in order to keep inflammatory chemicals around a tissue, because a lot of these inflammatory chemicals, materials, they need to remain in that area if it's injured for faster healing. Afterwards, however, getting back to physical activity after a structure is healed would be recommended. Another homeostatic imbalance is lymphedema. This is just severe localized edema. It's generally caused by something that is blocking flow into a lymphatic vessel. It might be a tumor blocking lymphatics, or maybe just damaged lymphatics in general because of a surgery. So lymphedema can improve if some of the lymphatics remain in this area. They can enlarge and kind of increase activity in order to get rid of this swelling. The swelling would be occurring because the fluid in the interstitial space, that's between the cells and blood vessels, between cells and lymphatics, can't get out of this space, can't get out of the interstitial space. And if it can't get out of the interstitial space by flowing into lymph vessels, we see swelling of tissues or around tissues. Our next topic is going to be looking at lymphoid cells. So a couple of different lymphoid cells to be looking at. A lot of them are going to be white blood cells, or cells that you've learned thus far as just kind of collectively white blood cells. But we're going to learn just a little bit more about them, and then in chapter 20, we'll look in detail at these types of cells. So lymphoid cells consist of two types. So immune system cells that are found in lymphoid tissue, and then we have supportive cells. These are supportive cells that kind of help us form our lymphoid tissue structure. A lot of that's going to be made up of reticular connective tissue. So our immune system cells include lymphocytes. It's a white blood cell. We know lymphocytes can turn into T or B cells. And lymphocytes tend to be of the adaptive immune system. Our adaptive immune system is specific, and that means that it acts specifically on one particular antigen. Whether the lymphocyte turns into a T cell or B cell determines how it acts, but both of them are going to act specifically against one antigen. So T cells and B cells protect us against antigens. An example of an antigen would be cell surface markers on bacteria, toxins, viruses, mismatched red blood cells, and cancer cells. T cells are going to be able to either indirectly or directly attack and destroy infected cells. B cells can turn into plasma cells. Plasma cells are considered an effector cell of the adaptive immune system, and that's because they can create antibodies. And antibodies travel in the blood and the lymph, or what we call the humors, and they're able to mark antigens for destruction by a couple of different mechanisms, one of which increases or amplifies phagocytosis. Other immune cells include macrophages, which are derived from monocytes. They're very phagocytic. They can phagocytose foreign substances and then go talk to T cells and say, hey, I found this thing. Are you interested in it? Do you recognize it? If so, please go destroy it. There's also dendritic cells, which can capture antigens as well and then go talk to T cells and lymph nodes. Both macrophages and dendritic cells are known antigen-presenting cells. They present antigens that they find to lymphocytes, mainly T cells, but they can also talk to B cells. Next, let's look at some supporting lymphoid cells. Reticular cells are going to be able to produce the stroma of a lot of our lymphoid organs, and that stroma tends to be made up of reticular fibers. So we say that a major tissue for lymphatic organs is reticular connective tissue. A stroma is kind of a network-like structure that supports cells. And since a lot of our lymphoid organs are just areas where cells can reside, like white blood cells, the reticular cells producing reticular fibers and generating reticular connective tissue are a great source for building this type of organ, which is going to be a filter or surveillance site, all for aiding the function of the immune system. So here in figure 19.4, we can just see reticular connective tissue. It is made up not only of reticular fibers generated by fibroblasts, but we also see plenty of white blood cells, macrophages, lymphocytes, and there would also be some reticular cells in there as well. The main functions of lymphoid tissue is to house all those white blood cells. Not only house them, but provide an area where once activated, they can proliferate or clone themselves in order to mount an immune response. We'd also find other surveillance vantage points for lymphocytes in lymph nodes, the spleen, and we would see that not only lymphocytes are housed in lymphoid tissue, but macrophages that we talked about as well. We're going to be able to filter lymph through these lymphoid tissue areas, and that allows us not only to survey that lymph fluid for any possible pathogen or foreign substance, but to kind of check it over on its way back to the heart. And again, keep in mind that the majority of lymphoid tissue is composed of reticular connective tissue. That's a type of loose connective tissue first introduced in chapter 4 of your lecture textbook. We know that on reticular fibers, you would find macrophages, and we would also see that the spaces between the reticular fibers, which generate the stroma of reticular connective tissue that we find in lymphatic organs, is going to be areas where the proliferation of lymphocytes can occur. There's two different types of lymphoid tissues, diffuse, and that would be kind of a loose arrangement of lymphoid cells. Find that pretty much everywhere, found in virtually every body organ. You find a lot of that in the lamina propria of mucous membranes, so kind of in that submucosa level of a lot of digestive organs, for example. And then there's lymphoid follicles, so kind of a more denser or condensed version of that diffuse lymphoid tissue. This lymphoid follicle tissue forms nodules. These nodules tend to contain germinal centers. And germinal centers are areas where B cells proliferate or can clone themselves once activated. Now, you might have these germinal centers be pretty much the majority of a lymphoid structure, or you might have them be just a part of a larger lymphoid structure, which is what we see in lymph nodes. We have isolated aggregations of germinal centers called Peyer's patches, both in the appendix and in the submucosa of the digestive system, mainly the small intestine. Other lymphoid organs are going to include not just lymph nodes, but we have to also mention the spleen, the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue like that of the Peyer's patches. And don't forget that even though it's kind of hard to visualize, diffuse lymphoid tissues do count as lymphoid organs. What we haven't talked about in a lot of detail, though, are the groupings for our lymphoid organs, which is primary and secondary lymphoid organs. Our primary lymphoid organs are red bone marrow and the thymus. That's it. Those are the only two primary lymphoid organs, and that's because those are the two locations where T and B cells mature. T and B cells are actually named after where they mature. So T cells mature in the thymus, and B cells mature in the bone marrow. Now, they both originate in the bone marrow, but the T cells will leave and go to the thymus for maturation. Secondary lymphoid organs are pretty much any other lymphoid organ that is not the red bone marrow and the thymus. So I listed those before: lymph nodes, spleen, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, diffuse lymphoid tissues throughout the body. Those are all going to count as secondary lymphoid organs, which are going to be areas where those lymphocytes can mature even further or kind of hang out until they have their first encounter with their specific antigen and become activated, then proliferate. So let's point out some of these lymphoid organs. We've yet to talk about the tonsils, which kind of an example of some diffuse lymphoid tissue, but they would be in the oral cavity or the back of the throat, so near the pharynx. We also have the thymus, one of the only structures that doesn't have reticular connective tissue as its stroma. We have bone marrow. Over here is the spleen. So that's a little bit behind the stomach, but always on that left side. We have the appendix near the cecum of the large intestine. And then around the small intestines, we have these aggregates of lymphoid nodules called Peyer's patches. So our next topic is going to be looking at lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are not a primary lymphoid organ, they're a secondary lymphoid organ, but they're definitely kind of the principal or main secondary lymphoid organ. There's hundreds of different lymph nodes found in the body. There's certain areas where the lymph nodes are a little bit closer to the surface of the body. Those areas are going to be the inguinal, axillary, and cervical regions of the body, where you see that collecting vessels converge into trunks, and then near those trunks you would have lymph nodes. So let's look at those regions. The cervical nodes, cervical probably gave you a clue, they're in the neck. Axillary nodes are at the armpit on both sides. And then you have the inguinal node down here near the inguinal region. There's two main functions of lymph nodes, and one is to be a filter, to cleanse the lymph, kind of just let it pass through, have it where we can just kind of check it for pathogens. We have macrophages there in our lymph nodes, able to remove and destroy microorganisms, cell debris, pretty much prevent any unwanted substances from being delivered to the blood. But another function, oftentimes forgotten because it's really easy to think of the lymph nodes as filters, is immune system activation. Not only can we remove things immediately from lymph, but some of those things, those foreign antigens, can be recognized by lymphocytes like T and B cells. And if they become activated, they're able to mount an immune response and attack those antigens that they're specific for. If we look at the structure of a lymph node, it's pretty small. They do vary in shape and size, but many of them are less than 2.5 centimeters, which is about an inch in diameter. Most of them are kind of small and bean-shaped. They do have a fibrous capsule. Parts of their capsule do go inwards, and that parts that go inwards towards or inside the lymph node are called trabeculae. You'll see terms like capsule and trabeculae again. There's two general regions of a lymph node, and that would be the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is just under the capsule, the medulla is much more central. So cortex is superficial. It's an area where you would find nodules. These nodules would generally contain germinal centers, which is where we have proliferating or heavily dividing B cells. The deep cortex closest to the medulla would be where you have T cells in transit, trying to kind of cross out of the lymph node either into lymphatics or into the blood. And T cells definitely circulate continuously among the blood, lymph, and the lymph nodes. And we also would find an abundant number of dendritic cells that are closely associated with T and B cells, so kind of in this area in between the medulla and cortex. Dendritic cells are probably the best antigen-presenting cell, so they're the best cell that finds antigens that T and B cells might recognize and bring them to areas where T and B cells are, like lymph nodes. So dendritic cells definitely play a role in activating both types of lymphocytes. The medulla is going to consist of medullary cords and medullary sinuses. So those lymph sinuses are a part of the medulla. We find them, though, throughout the node. A lot of the medullary cords, which are surrounded by these sinuses, contain B cells, T cells, and plasma cells. Plasma cells are just activated B cells. Plasma cells secrete antibodies. The lymph sinuses are where all the lymphatic capillaries really spanned by a lot of those reticular fibers that make up the stroma, not only of other lymphatic organs, but are also found in lymph nodes reside. We also would see that on those reticular fibers of the lymph sinuses, you would see macrophages. So this is really the area that's kind of checking for things that they can phagocytose, any foreign matter, cell debris that's coming through the lymph node. So the lymph sinuses essentially contain the filter material of a lymph node. So here's our basic structure of a lymph node. It is kind of blown up, looks a little bit bigger than it would be. We see that there are lymphatic vessels, so fluid would flow into the lymph node over here, and then it would leave via the efferent lymphatic vessels. We can see that there's a capsule, and then just inside the capsule is our cortex, and then parts of the capsule kind of make these little segments, each one containing a germinal center, where our proliferating B cells would be. We'd have circulating T cells kind of in between the cortex and the medulla, and then our medullary cords and sinuses would be in this kind of middle portion. Here's a histograph, so we can definitely see the lymphoid follicles in the cortex, open spaces, the cords and the sinuses. So sinuses are these open spaces, the darker parts are the cords in the medulla, and we can see the capsule. Oh, even a trabeculae up there. So circulation of the lymph nodes, we have lymph enter on that convex side via all those afferent lymphatic vessels. Then it drains out via the fewer efferent lymphatic vessels. The efferent lymphatic vessels are located on the concave side at the hilum of a lymph node. And we know that there are more afferent than efferent lymphatic vessels, and that is a common structural occurrence by looking at multiple lymph nodes. The reason this is the presence of fewer efferent vessels as opposed to afferent vessels allows the flow of lymph to stagnate or slow down as it goes through the lymph node. And it's the flow of that fluid that's inside the lymphatic slows down as it goes through the lymph node that allows not only lymphocytes time to activate, basically check and see if they recognize an antigen, but it also allows the macrophages to filter or act as filters and basically perform phagocytosis in time. So we do want to slow down that flow. We want to stagnate the flow just slightly as it goes through the lymph node, and that is going to be achieved by having more afferent and less efferent lymphatic vessels. And that we also want to note that lymph is traveling through several nodes at once. So even though it's stagnating slightly, it's not overall slowing down. So let's just look at that lymph node again. I just want to point out the afferent lymphatic vessels. There's more than the efferent. The efferent over here near the hilum. The afferent, think A, fluid arrives. Efferent, think E for exit, fluid exits. And then another clinical homeostatic imbalance is buboes. That's just inflamed, swollen, tender lymph nodes. Definitely painful. It happens when lymph nodes are overwhelmed by infection. They're overwhelmed by what they're trying to destroy. And this condition is sometimes just referred to as swollen glands. But the buboes can be pus-filled, essentially because neutrophils are trying to save the lymph nodes and they go and fight off or try to fight off the infection. The bubonic plague is actually named after buboes, which is a chief clinical feature of this disease or symptom. And lymph nodes can also become a secondary cancer site. If a cancer, say from the breast, metastasizes and moves into the lymphatics, it can be trapped in a lymph node. And once cancer infiltrates a lymph node, they can get swollen. But an interesting thing is that lymph nodes that have cancer in them are not generally painful, even if they become swollen. So that's one way to distinguish a cancerous lymph node from an infected lymph node. And then our next topic is going to be the spleen and a couple of the other secondary lymphoid organs. So make sure to watch that next part of the Chapter 19 PowerPoint.